My name is Rebecca Mitchell, and the night my father called me the disappointment at our family dinner, I smiled through every word while my world quietly shattered. He raised his wine glass, looked around the mahogany table at faces I'd known my entire life, and said with that signature grin of his, "My daughter's always been good at drawing pretty pictures while the real builders shape this city." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was worse. It was casual, comfortable, the kind of laughter that comes when everyone agrees with a truth so obvious it doesn't need defending. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I sat there in my mother's dining room, the same room where I'd eaten 1,000 meals, where light from the crystal chandelier painted everything in warm amber tones that should have felt like home but instead felt like a stage. My fork hovered over the untouched duck on my plate. My husband David's hand found my knee under the table. A gentle pressure that meant breathe, just breathe, we'll talk about this later. But there was nothing to talk about, not really. Because beneath the polite laughter and the clinking of silverware against china, beneath my father's booming voice as he launched into another story about closing deals and transforming neighborhoods, I already knew what I had to do. This wasn't the first time Frank Mitchell had made me feel small, but it would be the last time I let him erase me. The thing about Savannah is that everything here has a history. Every brick, every wrought iron gate, every sprawling oak draped in Spanish moss carries stories that go back centuries. My father built his fortune tearing down the old to make room for the new, and for 30 years, the city let him because progress, he'd say, doesn't wait for sentimentality. But I'd spent my entire career trying to save what he wanted to destroy, trying to prove that you could honor the past while building the future. The Whitmore building had been my masterpiece, the project that should have made my name in this town. Instead, it made his. Dinner at my parents' house happened every Sunday like clockwork, a tradition my mother upheld with the same precision she applied to arranging flowers and coordinating her pearls with her cardigans. The Mitchell family estate sat on the edge of Forsyth Park, a sprawling historic home that my father loved to call his testament to what hard work could achieve. Never mind that he'd gutted the interior and stripped away most of its original character. To him, the facade was enough. The appearance of preservation without the inconvenience of actually preserving anything. That particular Sunday, the October air had cooled just enough that my mother insisted we eat in the formal dining room instead of the back veranda. Richard Caldwell was there, my father's business partner and oldest friend, a man who laughed at all of Frank's jokes and nodded at all of Frank's opinions. My brother James had canceled last minute, some excuse about his kids having soccer tournaments, which meant it was just the 5 of us. Me, David, my parents, and Richard. A small audience, but large enough for my father to perform. The conversation had started innocently enough. My mother asked about David's work on the new hospital expansion, and he'd explained some complicated structural challenge they were solving. My father had listened with that expression he reserved for topics that bored him, the one where his eyes glazed slightly but his posture stayed engaged. Then Richard had mentioned seeing an article about the Whitmore building in Southern Architecture magazine, how it was being featured as a model for adaptive reuse projects across the region. That's when my father had seized the opening. He'd launched into the story of how he'd saved the Whitmore, how everyone on the city council had wanted to demolish it, how he'd fought to preserve this landmark and transform it into something the community could actually use. He described the challenges, the innovation required, the vision it took to see past the decay to the possibilities. He talked about the awards he'd received, the recognition from the Georgia Historical Society, the way the project had elevated Mitchell Development's reputation from simple construction to thoughtful urban renewal. I'd heard this speech before. Many times. At charity galas and ribbon cuttings, in newspaper interviews and podcast features. Each time the story grew more polished, more heroic, more completely his. And each time, I felt myself disappearing a little more from the narrative, like a photograph left too long in the sun. But that night when Richard had turned to me and said, almost as an afterthought, "Becca, you do something with old buildings too, don't you?" And my father had responded with that line about pretty pictures and real builders, something inside me finally cracked. Not loudly. Not dramatically, just a clean, quiet break like ice on a warm day. David had squeezed my knee harder. My mother had suddenly become very interested in refilling everyone's water glasses. Richard had chuckled and raised his own glass in agreement. And I had smiled, the same smile I'd perfected over 32 years of being Frank Mitchell's daughter, and said, "Just drawing, Dad. Nothing as important as what you do." The rest of the dinner blurred. There was dessert, my mother's famous pecan pie. There was coffee and brandy for the men. There was talk of upcoming projects and political maneuverings at City Hall. I participated enough to seem present, laughed at appropriate moments, asked polite questions. But inside I was somewhere else entirely. I was in the Whitmore building 3 years ago, standing in what used to be the main lobby, looking up at the soaring tin ceiling that everyone said couldn't be saved. I was at my drafting table at 2 in the morning, solving the structural puzzle of how to preserve the exterior walls while completely reimagining the interior. I was in meeting after meeting with the Historical Preservation Board, defending every choice, every compromise, every innovation that would allow that building to survive. I was everywhere my father had never been, doing all the work he'd never done, creating something he'd simply signed his name to. When we finally left that night, David waited until we were in the car, pulling away from the circular driveway before he spoke. "We need to talk about what just happened in there." "There's nothing to talk about," I'd said, watching the historic district roll past my window, all those beautiful old homes lit from within like lanterns. "Becca, he took credit for your entire project. Again. In front of everyone." "I know. And you just sat there. What else was I supposed to do? Stand up and announce that my father's a liar? Ruin Sunday dinner? Make my mother cry?" David had been quiet for a long moment, his hands tight on the steering wheel. We'd been married for 4 years, together for 6, and he knew me well enough to recognize when I was using calm as a shield. "You're the most talented preservation architect in this city," he'd finally said. "The Whitmore project was genius. Everyone in the industry knows it. But the public thinks it was all Frank, and you just let him keep saying it. What choice do I have? He owns the development company. His name is on the contracts. The city records list him as the principal architect because he has the developer's license. I was just the consultant, remember? Just the person who actually designed everything." "That's not true, and you know it. You have the original drawings. You have the emails. You have the structural calculations. You have proof. Proof doesn't matter when no one wants to see it." I turned to look at him then, this man who'd stood beside me through everything, who'd believed in my work even when my own family dismissed it. "David, my father has spent 3 decades building his reputation in this town. He sits on boards. He golfs with the mayor. He donates to every campaign and every charity. Who's going to believe me over him? Who's going to care?" He'd pulled into our driveway then, our small townhouse in the Victorian district that we'd restored ourselves, and turned off the engine. In the sudden silence I could hear the wind moving through the live oaks, that particular savanna sound that's like breathing. "I care," he'd said quietly. "And I think you care more than you're admitting. I saw your face tonight when he said that. You're done pretending this doesn't hurt." He was right, of course. I was done. But I didn't know yet what being done actually meant, or what I was going to do about it. I just knew that something fundamental had shifted, that the version of me who'd walked into that dinner was not the same version who'd walked out. The Whitmore building sits on the corner of Broughton and Whitaker, a 4-story brick structure that had been slowly dying for 20 years before I saved it. Built in 1892 as a commercial building, it had housed everything from a department store to insurance offices to a failed nightclub. By the time the city started seriously discussing its fate, it was a decaying shell with a collapsed roof, water damage on every floor, and a facade so deteriorated that chunks of decorative terracotta would occasionally fall onto the sidewalk below. The city council had voted twice to demolish it. The cost of restoration, they argued, far exceeded the value of the building. It sat in a prime location, and several developers had already submitted proposals for what they could build on that lot once the Whitmore was gone. My father had been one of them. Mitchell Development had drawn up plans for a sleek mixed-use tower. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. All glass and steel and modern lines that would have looked impressive in Atlanta or Charlotte, but completely wrong in historic Savannah. I'd been working for a small preservation firm at the time, fresh out of graduate school with a master's degree in historic preservation and more passion than sense. When I'd heard the city was accepting final proposals for alternatives to demolition, I'd spent 6 weeks working on nothing else. I'd measured every wall, documented every architectural detail, researched the building's history, and designed a comprehensive adaptive reuse plan that would preserve the historic character while creating economically viable modern spaces. My proposal had been thorough, innovative, and expensive. Too expensive, the city council said. They'd thanked me for my enthusiasm but explained that dreams didn't pay for structural repairs. That's when my father had approached me with his offer. Mitchell Development would fund the project and handle the construction, but I would be the preservation consultant, the one who made sure the historic elements were properly restored. It would be a collaboration, he'd said. His resources and reputation, my expertise and vision. A family project that would benefit everyone. I'd been naive enough to believe him. The contract had been written to list Frank Mitchell as the principal architect of record, with me as the consulting preservation specialist. He'd explained this was necessary for licensing and liability reasons, that developers needed to be listed as the primary on projects of this scale, that it was just a technicality. I'd signed because he was my father, and because I'd wanted so desperately to save that building that I'd have agreed to almost anything. And because somewhere deep down, I believed that once the project was complete, once everyone saw what we'd accomplished, the truth of who'd done what would be obvious. I'd spent 18 months on that building. I'd been there when they carefully removed and cataloged every piece of the decorative tin ceiling. I'd been there when they discovered the original heart pine floors under layers of linoleum and carpet. I'd been there solving problem after problem, the kind of problems that only someone who truly understood both historic construction and modern engineering could solve. How do you bring a 19th century building up to current codes without destroying what makes it historically significant? How do you install modern HVAC and electrical systems in a structure never designed for them? How do you preserve the exterior while completely reimagining the interior layout? Every solution had been mine. Every drawing, every specification, every decision about what to save and what could be modified. David had helped with the structural calculations, but the vision, the design, the thing that made the Whitmore building a success, that had all come from me. The project had been completed a year and a half ago, and it had exceeded everyone's expectations. The ground floor was now a mix of retail and restaurant space. The upper floors had been converted into high-end apartments with exposed brick walls and massive windows that showcased those carefully restored tin ceilings. The building had won awards. It had been featured in magazines. It had sparked a renewed interest in preservation-based development throughout the historic district. And my father had accepted every accolade, given every interview, taken every bow. My name appeared in the project documentation as a consultant, buried in a list of contractors and specialists. If you knew where to look, you could find me mentioned in the fine print. But to anyone reading the Southern Architecture article or attending the Georgia Historical Society Awards ceremony or listening to my father's speeches, the Whitmore building was Frank Mitchell's triumph. His vision, his risk, his legacy. I told myself I didn't care about the recognition. I told myself that knowing I'd saved the building was enough, that the work itself was the reward. But sitting at that dinner table, listening to my father describe challenges I'd solved as if he'd solved them, hearing him accept credit for innovations I'd created, I'd realized I'd been lying to myself. I did care. I cared desperately. Because it wasn't just about one building. It was about my entire career, my identity, my worth. If I let him take the Whitmore, what else would I let him take? What would be left of me if I kept disappearing from my own story? That night after we got home, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to David's steady breathing beside me, watching shadows from the streetlight move across our ceiling, and thinking about legacies. My father loved to talk about legacy, about leaving a mark on the world, about being remembered. The irony was that he was building his legacy by erasing mine. Around 3 a.m, I got up and went to my home office, a converted bedroom where I kept all my project files. I pulled out the Whitmore folder, thick with drawings and photographs and documentation. I spread it across my desk and looked at my own handwriting on the structural notes, my signature on the original concept drawings, the timestamps on the digital files that proved when I'd created them. It was all there, a complete record of what I'd actually done. But David had been right earlier. Having proof didn't matter if no one ever saw it. And who was going to see it? Who was going to care enough to look past Frank Mitchell's reputation and ask questions about who really designed his most celebrated project? I was still sitting there when dawn started to lighten the windows, still staring at the evidence of my own work, when my phone buzzed with an email. The sender was listed as M. Webb, an address I didn't recognize. The subject line was simple. The Whitmore wasn't his first. I opened it with shaking hands. The message was brief, just 3 sentences. Your father has been taking credit for other people's work for 20 years. I have documentation. If you want the truth, meet me at River Street Cafe tomorrow at noon. There was no signature, no explanation, nothing to tell me who this person was or why they were contacting me. But somehow I knew this message was real, and that opening it had just changed everything. I didn't sleep at all that night. I read the email 17 times, each time finding new questions buried in those 3 simple sentences. Your father has been taking credit for other people's work for 20 years. 20 years meant this went back to before I was even out of high school, back to when Frank Mitchell was just beginning to build the reputation that now made him untouchable in Savannah's development circles. I have documentation. What kind of documentation? Old contracts? Testimonies? Proof that would hold up under scrutiny? Or just rumors and circumstantial evidence? If you want the truth, meet me at River Street Cafe tomorrow at noon. Why there? Why noon? And most importantly, who was M. Webb? I spent the hours before dawn searching for that name online. Marcus Webb, attorney in Atlanta. Michelle Webb, real estate agent in Charleston. Martin Webb, retired professor at Georgia Southern. None of them seemed connected to architecture or development or my father. I tried searching for the email address itself, but it came up empty, probably a temporary account created just to contact me. Whoever this person was, they'd been careful. They didn't want to be traced until we met face to face. David found me still at my desk when he woke up at 6, my laptop surrounded by cold coffee cups and printouts of my Whitmore documentation. He leaned against the doorframe in his pajamas, hair sticking up on one side, and just looked at me with that expression that meant he already knew I'd been up all night spiraling. "Tell me you didn't work through the night again," he said. I turned the laptop toward him, showing him the email. He read it slowly, his expression shifting from concern to alert. Who's M. Webb? I have no idea. But they say they have proof that my father's been stealing credit for decades. Could be a trap. Could be someone trying to get information from you or set you up somehow. Or it could be someone who finally has evidence that backs up what I already know is true. I stood up, my back stiff from hours in the desk chair, and walked to the window. Our street was just starting to wake up. A jogger passing under the streetlights, a neighbor retrieving their newspaper. Normal Monday morning activities for normal people, who weren't contemplating whether to meet a stranger who claimed to have proof their father was a fraud. I'm going to meet them. Becca, think about this. You don't know this person. You don't know what they want. They want the same thing I want. The truth. Maybe. Or maybe they have an agenda. Maybe they're a competitor of your dad's trying to dig up dirt. Maybe they're a disgruntled former employee. Maybe they're just someone who gets off on stirring up family drama. I turned to face him, and he must have seen something in my expression because his shoulders dropped slightly in resignation. You've already decided, he said. I have to know. Even if it's nothing, even if this person is crazy or lying or whatever, I have to know if there's more to this than just the Whitmore. Because if it's a pattern, if he's been doing this for 20 years like they say, then it's not just about me. It's about everyone he stepped on to build his empire. David crossed the room and put his hands on my shoulders, looking at me with that steady gaze that always made me feel both seen and safe. Then I'm coming with you. You have work. That hospital project meeting is today. I'll reschedule. I'm not letting you walk into this alone. Part of me wanted to argue, to insist I could handle it myself, to prove I didn't need protection or backup. But a bigger part of me was grateful. Whatever I was about to walk into, having David beside me made it feel less like jumping off a cliff, and more like taking a calculated risk. River Street Cafe sat along the riverfront, one of those tourist-friendly spots with outdoor seating, and a view of the cargo ships moving up and down the Savannah River. At noon on a Monday in October, it was busy but not packed, a mix of tourists and locals grabbing lunch. David and I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the back corner with a view of the entrance. I ordered coffee I wouldn't drink and tried not to look as nervous as I felt. What if they don't show? I asked. Then we have a nice lunch and go home. What if they do show and it's all nonsense? Then we have the same information we had this morning and we go home. What if it's real? What if they actually have proof? David reached across the table and took my hand. Then we figure out what to do with it. Together. At 12:03, a man walked in who looked like he was searching for someone. He was probably in his late 50s, thin in a way that suggested weight loss rather than natural build, with graying hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt that had seen better days, and he carried a leather messenger bag that bulged with papers. He scanned the cafe, and when his eyes landed on me, something shifted in his expression. Recognition maybe, or confirmation. He walked directly to our table. Rebecca Mitchell? That's me. And you're M. Webb? Marcus Webb. He glanced at David. I didn't know you'd bring company. This is my husband, David Harrison. Whatever you have to say to me, you can say in front of him. Marcus hesitated, then nodded and slid into the chair across from us. Up close, he looked tired, like a man who hadn't slept well in years. There were shadows under his eyes and lines around his mouth that spoke of stress or worry or both. He set the messenger bag carefully on the floor beside him, protective, like it contained something precious. Thank you for meeting me, he said. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. I don't know you, and your email was cryptic at best. Had to be. I've been careful for a long time, making sure I didn't attract attention. But when I saw that article about the Whitmore building, when I read your father's quotes about his vision and his design work, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. A server approached and Marcus ordered black coffee with hands that trembled slightly. We waited in tense silence until the server left, and then I leaned forward. Your email said my father's been taking credit for other people's work for 20 years. Explain that. Marcus pushed his glasses up and took a breath like a man about to jump into cold water. I used to work for the city planning department. I was the director of historic preservation for 12 years, from 2003 to 2015. During that time, I reviewed every major development project in the historic district, including several of your father's. I remember. You left the department suddenly. There were rumors about a scandal, but nothing was ever confirmed publicly. There was no scandal. Not officially. But I discovered something that certain people wanted to stay hidden, and when I wouldn't let it go, I was pressured to resign. They made it clear that if I went public with what I knew, my career in urban planning would be over. Not just in Savannah but everywhere. So I took the severance package and disappeared. David leaned forward, his engineer's mind already working through the implications. What did you discover? Marcus reached down and pulled a manila folder from his messenger bag. It was worn at the edges, clearly handled many times. He laid it on the table between us but kept his hand on it, as if reluctant to let it go. In 2009, there was a project to restore the old Mercer House carriage building. Beautiful structure, historic significance, badly deteriorated. The city put out a request for proposals, and several firms submitted designs. There was a young architect named Claire Thompson who worked for a small firm, and her proposal was extraordinary, innovative, respectful of the historical elements, economically feasible. The review committee was prepared to approve it. He paused as the server returned with his coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup but didn't drink. Then Frank Mitchell got involved. He approached the city council directly, bypassed the review committee, and proposed that Mitchell Development take over the project. He submitted a design that was remarkably similar to Claire Thompson's proposal, nearly identical actually in all the important ways, but he had the political connections and the financial backing, and the city council approved his version instead. That's not unusual, David said carefully. Designs get modified and resubmitted all the time in development. Similar solutions to the same problems. Except Mitchell's submission came 2 weeks after Claire Thompson's proposal was reviewed by the committee, and I had access to both the original submission files and the metadata on the digital drawings. Claire's were dated March 15th. Mitchell's were dated March 28th. But the metadata showed they were created on March 16 using files that had originally been created by Claire's computer. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He copied her work. He didn't just copy it. He modified it just enough to make it look different on the surface, then submitted it as his own. Claire tried to fight it, claimed intellectual property theft, but she was a junior architect at a small firm going up against Frank Mitchell. The city's legal department reviewed her complaint and said there wasn't enough evidence to prove theft, just unfortunate similarities. Her firm dropped her rather than fight Mitchell's lawyers, and she left Savannah. Last I heard, she was working at a firm in Nashville, and she never took on another historic preservation project. Marcus opened the folder and spread papers across our table. I saw architectural drawings, email printouts, official city documents stamped with dates and signatures. He pointed to one drawing, then another, showing how specific design elements matched between the two proposals. This was the first time I noticed it, he continued. But once I started looking, I found more. In 2011, there was the Cotton Exchange renovation. In 2013, the old fire station conversion. Each time, a talented but less established architect would submit a strong proposal, and each time Mitchell Development would somehow end up with a remarkably similar design getting approved instead. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Why didn't you go public with this? I asked, even though I thought I already knew the answer. I tried. I compiled all the evidence and took it to the city manager. I explained the pattern, showed the documentation, made the case that the city was enabling intellectual property theft. I was told that my concerns were noted and that they'd look into it. 2 weeks later, I was called into a meeting with the city attorney, the city manager, and a representative from Mitchell Development. They explained that I was making serious accusations against a pillar of the Savannah business community, based on circumstantial evidence and unfortunate coincidences. They said that if I continued pursuing this, they'd have no choice but to investigate whether I had personal or financial motivations for trying to damage Frank Mitchell's reputation. The implication was clear. Drop it or lose everything. So you resigned, David said. I took early retirement with a generous severance package and signed a non-disclosure agreement. For the past 10 years, I've watched Frank Mitchell win awards and give speeches and build his legend, and I've stayed quiet because I had a family to support and a reputation to protect. But when I saw that article about the Whitmore building, when I read Mitchell claiming credit for innovations and solutions that sounded nothing like his previous work, I started digging. And I found you. He pulled out another folder. This one newer, and slid it toward me. These are the original concept drawings for the Whitmore project, as submitted to the City Planning Office for preliminary review. They're dated 2 years before Mitchell Development officially took on the project. They're signed by Rebecca Mitchell, preservation consultant, and they show a design that's essentially identical to what was eventually built. I opened the folder with shaking hands. There were my drawings, the ones I'd created when I was still working at the small preservation firm, the ones I'd submitted as part of that initial proposal that the city had rejected as too expensive. I'd forgotten about these. I'd assumed they'd been lost in city files somewhere, irrelevant once my father's project had been approved. How did you get these? I whispered. I still have friends in the planning office. People who remember when things were done differently, who aren't entirely comfortable with how cozy the relationship between Mitchell Development and City Hall has become. When I asked if anyone had archived copies of the original Whitmore proposals, someone quietly made copies for me. Technically, they're public record, but practically, they're buried deep enough that no one looks for them. I stared at my own signature on those old drawings, at the date stamp showing I'd created them 3 years ago, and felt the full weight of what Marcus was telling me. My father hadn't just taken credit for my work on the Whitmore. He'd taken my actual design, my original proposal, and resubmitted it as his own project after the city had rejected my version for lack of funding. He'd used his political connections and his company's resources to make my vision happen, then erased me from the story entirely. There are others, Marcus said quietly. At least 5 other projects over the years where the same pattern appears. Young architects submit proposals, Mitchell Development comes in with similar designs, the original architects get pushed out or bought out or intimidated out. Your father has built his reputation as a visionary developer by systematically stealing other people's visions. David's hand found mine under the table, squeezing hard. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't look at Marcus. I could only stare at those drawings and feel the full scope of the betrayal crystallizing into something sharp and undeniable. Why are you showing me this? I finally asked. Why now? Because you have something the others didn't. You're his daughter. You have access to his company files, his personal papers, his computers. You can find the evidence that I can't access anymore, the internal emails and documents that would prove this wasn't just coincidence or parallel thinking. You can build a case that might actually stick. You want me to investigate my own father. I want you to expose a pattern of theft that's been destroying careers and corrupting the development process in this city for 2 decades. But yes, that means investigating your father. And I understand if you can't do that. Family loyalty is powerful, and Frank Mitchell is your father. But he's also the man who stole your work, who humiliated you at a family dinner, who's built his entire legacy on other people's talent. You have a choice to make about whether you can live with that. The cafe noise seemed very far away suddenly. The conversation of tourists at nearby tables, the clink of dishes, the hum of the river traffic outside. All of it faded into background static. I looked at David, and he looked back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not judgment, not encouragement, just a steady presence that said, whatever you decide, I'm here. If I do this, I said slowly, if I start digging and find what you think I'll find, what then? You said yourself that you were threatened and forced out when you tried to expose this. What makes you think anything would be different now? Because you have what I never had. You have proof of your own involvement. You have documentation showing you created the work he claimed as his. That's not circumstantial evidence or suspicious similarities. That's direct proof of fraud. And if you can connect your case to the others, show a pattern of behavior rather than a single incident, it becomes much harder to dismiss as a misunderstanding or a family dispute. It also becomes a much bigger story, David said. The kind of story that destroys reputations and ends careers and tears families apart. Yes, Marcus agreed. It does. Which is why I'm not telling you what to do. I'm giving you information and letting you decide what to do with it. But I want you to know that if you decide to pursue this, you won't be alone. There are other people who've been waiting for someone with the standing and the evidence to finally hold Frank Mitchell accountable. I can connect you with them. I can help you build the case. But only if you're willing to see it through, regardless of what it costs. I gathered up the papers slowly, looking at each one. My drawings. Claire Thompson's designs. Email chains showing suspicious timing. City documents with telling dates and signatures. It was all there. A roadmap to my father's deception laid out in black and white. I need to think about this, I said. I need to go home and process what you've told me and figure out if I can actually do what you're suggesting. Of course. Take whatever time you need. But Rebecca, Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to something urgent and almost pleading, don't take too long. Your father is working on his memoir. He's planning a book about his career, his projects, his philosophy of development. I've heard he's already met with publishers. If that book comes out with the same lies and stolen credit that he's been building his reputation on for years, it becomes much harder to challenge the narrative. The public story solidifies into accepted history. That detail hit me harder than anything else he'd said. A memoir. My father was writing a memoir where he'd immortalize all his supposed achievements in print, creating a permanent record of lies that would outlive us all. I thought about future generations reading that book, architects and developers studying his supposed innovations, my own eventual children or grandchildren seeing their grandfather celebrated for work he'd stolen, including work he'd stolen from me. How do you know about the memoir? I asked. He mentioned it in an interview with the Savannah Business Journal last month. Said he wanted to leave a legacy for future generations, share the lessons he'd learned, inspire the next generation of developers. The article made it sound like he was already well into writing it. David and I left the cafe an hour later with Marcus's folders tucked into my bag, and his phone number saved in my contacts. We walked along the riverfront in silence, watching the container ships move slowly down the river, watching tourists take selfies in front of the historic buildings that lined the street. Every one of those buildings had a story, had architects and builders and visionaries who'd created something that lasted. How many of those stories had been corrupted or erased or stolen? How many Frank Mitchells were there in the world, building reputations on other people's work? What are you thinking? David finally asked. I'm thinking about what my mother said once years ago. I must have been in high school, and I'd asked her why she never pursued her own career after she had kids. She said that sometimes in a marriage one person's dreams get priority, and you have to decide if you can live with that. I remember thinking it was the saddest thing I'd ever heard. And now I'm wondering if I've been doing the same thing my whole life. Letting my father's dreams take priority. Letting his version of events become the accepted story. Staying quiet because speaking up would be inconvenient or uncomfortable or disloyal. We reached our car, but I didn't get in. I leaned against the hood and looked back at the river, at the city I loved, the city my father claimed to have shaped. 20 years, I said. Marcus said 20 years of this. How many architects had their careers derailed? How many brilliant designs got credit stolen? How many people stayed quiet because they couldn't fight him? And how many people are going to get hurt if you do fight him? David asked gently. Your mother. Your brother. The people who work for Mitchell Development. Your own career and reputation. This isn't just about exposing one man's lies. It's about dismantling everything he's built, and a lot of people have their lives tied up in that. I know. Believe me, I know. But David, if I don't do this, if I just let it go and move on, what does that make me? I spent 18 months saving the Whitmore building, pouring everything I had into that project, and he took it like it was nothing. Like my work was his to claim, like my career was just a stepping stone for his legacy. And apparently he's been doing that to people for 2 decades, and everyone just lets him because he's powerful and connected and untouchable. So what do you want to do? I looked at my husband, this good man who'd stood beside me through everything, who'd held my hand under dinner tables and squeezed my knee when my father dismissed my work and stayed up late helping me solve structural equations for buildings I was trying to save. I thought about the life we'd built together, the home we'd made, the future we'd planned. And I thought about living the rest of that life knowing I'd had a chance to demand the truth and chose comfort instead. I want to find out if Marcus is right, I said. I want to look at my father's files and see if there's evidence of what he's been doing. And if there is, if it's all true and provable and real, then I want to make sure the truth doesn't stay buried anymore. Even if it destroys your relationship with your father? There's no relationship to destroy. Not a real one. Real relationships aren't built on lies and theft and humiliation. Whatever I had with my father ended the night he called me a disappointment for doing work he was simultaneously stealing credit for. I just didn't fully realize it until now. David nodded slowly, then straightened up and opened my car door. Then let's go home and look at those files. Let's see what we're really dealing with before we decide the next step. That night, we spread Marcus's documentation across our dining room table, like we were preparing for a trial, which I supposed we were. There were the architectural drawings, showing the clear similarities between original proposals and Mitchell Development's final projects. There were the dates and metadata proving the timing of file creation. There were emails from city planning officials discussing proposals, with telling gaps where correspondence should have been but wasn't. There were newspaper articles about Frank Mitchell's award-winning projects, each one celebrating his vision and innovation without mentioning the architects whose work had informed or directly inspired those designs. And there was my own work, the Whitmore drawings I'd created 3 years ago, the proposal the city had rejected, the design my father had somehow transformed into his celebrated project. I laid those drawings next to the published photos of the completed Whitmore building, and saw my vision realized exactly as I'd imagined it, down to the smallest details. Every choice I'd made, every problem I'd solved, every innovation I'd created, all of it was there in that building. And none of it was credited to me. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 2 years. David did the same, and we spent the day doing something I'd never imagined I'd do. We broke into my father's office at Mitchell Development Corporation. Not literally broke in. I still had my key card from consulting on the Whitmore project, and security knew me well enough that they didn't question why Frank Mitchell's daughter was stopping by on a Tuesday morning. I told the receptionist I needed to pick up some old files my father had mentioned, smiled in that easy way that said this was routine and unremarkable, and walked straight to the executive suite like I belonged there. My father was at a city council meeting until at least 2 o'clock. His assistant Patricia had mentioned it at Sunday dinner, complaining about how these budget sessions always ran long. That gave us roughly 4 hours to search his office for evidence of 2 decades of theft. David stayed by the door watching the hallway, while I sat down at my father's massive oak desk and opened his computer. I knew his password because he'd never bothered to change it from the default the IT department had set up years ago. Franklin 1959, his first name and birth year. For a man so concerned with building an untouchable reputation, he was remarkably careless about digital security. His desktop was organized the same way his physical office was, everything labeled and categorized and filed with military precision. There was a folder labeled Projects, subdivided by year. Another labeled Contracts. Another labeled Awards and Recognition. And buried near the bottom, one labeled Personal Archive. I started with Projects and began opening files from 10 years ago, looking for anything related to the cases Marcus had mentioned. The Cotton Exchange renovation from 2011. I found the folder easily enough, filled with final drawings and contracts and correspondence with the city. But there was also a subfolder labeled Preliminary, and when I opened it, I found something that made my hands go cold. There were 2 sets of drawings for the Cotton Exchange project. One set was dated May 2011 and signed by Mitchell Development's in-house architect. The other set was dated March 2011 and signed by someone named James Winters from a firm I didn't recognize. The designs were nearly identical in their major elements: the layout of the commercial spaces, the treatment of the historic facade, the solution for the structural challenges. But the March drawings included handwritten notes and calculations, the kind of working documents an architect creates while developing a design. The May drawings were clean, polished, final versions with no trace of the development process. I photographed both sets with my phone, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then I kept searching. The old fire station conversion from 2013. Another dual set of drawings, another architect whose work had been replicated and refined just enough to look like evolution rather than theft. The Mercer House carriage building from 2009 that Marcus had mentioned specifically. Same pattern. Original proposal from an outside architect in March, final Mitchell development drawings in April that captured all the innovative solutions from the original, while technically being just different enough to avoid obvious copying. By the time I worked my way through a decade of projects, I'd found 8 clear instances of the same pattern. Young architects submitting proposals. Mitchell development coming in weeks later with suspiciously similar designs. The original architects fading from the record while my father's reputation grew. David kept watch by the door, occasionally checking his phone for the time. We were 90 minutes in when he whispered, "Becca, we should wrap this up soon. We're pushing our luck." Just a few more minutes. I want to check his email archives. I opened his email program and started searching for names. Claire Thompson, the architect Marcus had mentioned from the Mercer House project. I found an email thread from April 2009 between my father and Richard Caldwell, his business partner. Frank's message read, "The Thompson design is exactly what we need for the carriage house project. Clean, historically appropriate, economically feasible. Problem is the city's already seen it attached to her firm's proposal. Thoughts?" Richard's response came 2 hours later. "Modify the facade treatment and the interior layout just enough to make it legally distinct. We have the political capital to get city council approval, regardless of the planning committee's recommendation. Thompson's firm is small. No resources to fight us even if they suspect something. By the time they could mount a legal challenge, the project will be approved and under construction." My father's reply was a single sentence. "Make it happen." I photographed the entire email chain, then kept searching. I found similar exchanges for 3 other projects, the same casual discussion of taking other people's work and modifying it just enough to avoid legal liability. The tone throughout was businesslike, practical, completely devoid of any awareness that they were discussing intellectual property theft. To them, this was just smart business, using every available resource to win projects and build the company's reputation. In the personal archive folder, I found something even more damning. There was a document titled Mitchell Development Strategic Approach, dated 2008, that laid out what my father called his competitive advantage strategy. The relevant section read, "Rather than investing heavily in innovative design development, Mitchell Development will leverage the competitive RFP process to identify the strongest design concepts from smaller firms who lack the political connections and financial resources to execute large projects. By maintaining close relationships with city planning officials and council members, we can ensure early access to submitted proposals and sufficient time to develop legally distinct variations that incorporate the best elements of competing designs. This approach allows us to consistently deliver award-winning projects while minimizing design development costs and timeline risks. It was all there. A written strategy document describing exactly what Marcus had accused my father of doing, framed as legitimate business practice rather than theft. My father had created a systematic approach to stealing other people's work, and had documented it in his own corporate files like it was something to be proud of. I was photographing this document when David hissed from the doorway, "Someone's coming." I closed all the files and folders, trying to return the computer to exactly the state I'd found it in. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely control the mouse. David pulled me away from the desk just as footsteps approached down the hallway. Patricia Monroe, my father's longtime assistant, appeared in the doorway. She looked surprised to see us but not alarmed. "Rebecca? I didn't know you were stopping by today." "Just picking up some old Whitmore files Dad said he had," I said, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. "We were just leaving." Patricia's eyes moved past me to the desk, to the computer still glowing with its screensaver, to the way David was positioned like he'd been keeping watch. Something shifted in her expression, a calculation happening behind her professional smile. "Did you find what you needed?" she asked carefully. "Yes, thank you. We'll get out of your way." We walked past her toward the elevator, moving at a normal pace even though every instinct screamed to run. I didn't breathe properly until we were in the parking garage in our car, pulling out onto the street. "Do you think she knew?" David asked. "That we were snooping instead of picking up files?" "Probably. Whether she'll mention it to my father is another question. If she does, he'll know you're looking into his projects. He'll have time to prepare, to hide evidence, to build his defense." "I know. But David, I found it. Everything Marcus said was true. There are files documenting years of this. Email chains where he and Richard discuss stealing designs. A strategy document that literally describes their approach to taking other people's work. It's all there." I pulled out my phone and showed him the photos I'd taken. He scrolled through them slowly, his expression growing darker with each image. When he finished, he handed the phone back and sat in silence for a long moment. "This is worse than I thought," he finally said. "This isn't opportunistic theft or a few questionable decisions. This is systematic corporate policy." He built his entire business model around stealing from people who couldn't fight back. "And now I have proof." "Now you have proof that you obtained by accessing his private computer without permission. A lawyer would call that inadmissible evidence, possibly illegal search and seizure. I'm his daughter, and I used a key card he gave me to access an office where I've worked as a consultant. That's not breaking and entering. It's also not the kind of evidence that would hold up in court if it came to that. You need Marcus's documentation, the public records, the pattern across multiple projects. Your father's internal files might show intent, but they're not enough on their own." He was right, and I knew. But seeing those files, reading those emails, understanding the full scope of what my father had been doing, it had changed something fundamental in me. This wasn't just about the Whitmore anymore, or even about my own stolen credit. This was about 2 decades of young architects having their careers destroyed, their best work stolen, their confidence shattered. This was about a corrupt system where political connections mattered more than talent, where small firms couldn't compete with developers who cheated, where the same old names won the same old awards while actual innovators disappeared. We drove home in silence, and I spent the rest of that afternoon organizing everything I had. Marcus's files in one pile, my photographs of my father's documents in another, my own Whitmore documentation in a third. I created a timeline showing project after project following the same pattern. Young architect submits proposal. Mitchell Development submits similar design weeks later. Original architect disappears from the project. My father wins awards and recognition. By evening, I had a comprehensive case documenting systematic theft spanning from 2009 to the present. I had names of at least 8 architects whose work had been stolen. I had email evidence showing intent and planning. I had my father's own strategy document describing his approach. And I had my personal experience with the Whitmore, complete with my original drawings proving I designed the project he'd claimed as his masterpiece. What I didn't have was any idea what to do with all of it. David made dinner while I sat at the dining room table staring at the assembled evidence. He set a plate in front of me that I barely touched. Finally, he sat down across from me and said what we'd both been thinking. If you take this public, there's no going back. Your father's career will be over. His reputation will be destroyed. Mitchell Development will probably fold or have to be completely restructured. Your mother will be devastated. Your brother will have to choose sides. Your entire family will be torn apart. I know. And you'll be the one who did it. People won't remember the evidence or the pattern of theft. They'll remember that Frank Mitchell's daughter destroyed him. Some will call you brave. Others will call you vindictive or disloyal. Your name will be tied to this scandal forever. I know that too. So I need you to be absolutely certain. Is this worth it? Is exposing him worth everything it's going to cost? I looked at the evidence spread across our table, at the names of architects whose stories had been erased, at my own drawings for the Whitmore building that should have been my triumph and instead became his. I thought about my father's planned memoir. About him immortalizing his lies in a book that would sit on library shelves and be studied by future generations. I thought about the next young architect who'd submit a brilliant proposal only to watch Frank Mitchell steal it and claim credit. Yes, I said. It's worth it. Not because I want revenge, though I'd be lying if I said there wasn't some satisfaction in finally holding him accountable, but because the truth matters. Because the people he stole from deserve to have their work acknowledged. Because the next generation of architects deserves a fair system where talent matters more than connections. And because I can't live with myself if I have this evidence and do nothing with it. David reached across the table and took my hand. Then we need a lawyer. Someone who specializes in intellectual property and professional ethics. Someone who can help us present this evidence in a way that can't be dismissed or buried. I don't even know where to start with that. I might. David pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Remember Jessica Chun? We went to grad school with her. She went into intellectual property law, specializes in creative industries and professional malpractice. Last I heard, she was at a firm in Atlanta. Let me reach out, see if she'd be willing to consult. While David made calls, I texted Marcus Webb. Found evidence. Worse than you thought. We need to talk. His response came almost immediately. Tomorrow. Same place. 10 a.m. The next morning, David and I met Marcus at a different location. A quiet park near the Bonaventure Cemetery where early morning joggers and dog walkers provided cover, but the spaces between benches offered privacy. Marcus arrived carrying the same worn messenger bag, but now he looked energized rather than exhausted, like a man who'd been carrying a burden for years and could finally see the possibility of setting it down. I showed him everything I'd found. He went through each photograph methodically, occasionally pausing to make notes or ask clarifying questions. When he got to the strategy document, his hands tightened on the paper. This is it, he said quietly. This is what I could never prove. I knew there had to be something like this, some internal acknowledgement of what they were doing. But I never had access to Mitchell Development's files. You found the smoking gun. Except I found it by accessing my father's computer without explicit permission. David says that makes it legally problematic. Maybe for a criminal case. But we're not building a criminal case. We're building a case for professional ethics violations, for civil liability, for public exposure. The standards of evidence are different. And combined with the public records I already have, with the testimony of the architects whose work was stolen, with your own documentation of the Whitmore project, this creates an undeniable pattern. He pulled out a list from his bag. I've spent the last 10 years tracking down the architects your father stole from. Most of them have moved on, built careers elsewhere, decided fighting wasn't worth the cost. But I've stayed in touch with several of them. Claire Thompson from the Mercer House project. She's in Nashville now, but she's never forgotten what happened. James Winters from the Cotton Exchange. He left architecture entirely, but he kept all his documentation. There are others. If we approach them with your evidence, with proof that this was systematic rather than isolated incidents, some of them might be willing to come forward. And then what? I asked. We go to the media? File a lawsuit? Report him to the State Architecture Board? All of the above eventually. But first we need to document everything thoroughly. We need statements from the other architects. We need expert analysis comparing the stolen designs to the final Mitchell development projects. We need to create a case so comprehensive and well documented that it can't be dismissed as a family dispute or sour grapes from failed competitors. That could take months. It could. But your father's memoir gives us a deadline. Once that book is published, the public narrative solidifies. Right now, we have a window where we can challenge the story before it's set in stone. We need to move deliberately but not slowly. David had been quiet through this exchange, but now he spoke up. Jessica Chun can meet with us next week. She reviewed the photographs I sent her and says there's definitely grounds for a case, both civil and ethics complaints. But she wants to see all the documentation before she commits to representing anyone. She's making it clear this would be a high-profile, contentious case that could drag on for years. Years, I repeated. The word felt heavy. Years of legal battles, years of family division, years of being known as the daughter who destroyed her father. But also potentially years of other architects coming forward, of the truth finally being acknowledged, of a corrupt system being exposed and possibly reformed. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. Rebecca, I need you to understand something. When I tried to expose this 10 years ago, I was one person with circumstantial evidence and no personal stake in any of the stolen projects. They crushed me anyway. You're Frank Mitchell's daughter with direct evidence of theft from your own work. You have standing that I never had. But they're going to come after you harder than they came after me. Your father will use every connection, every dollar, every piece of leverage he has. He'll paint you as a disgruntled daughter with father issues. He'll dig into your professional history looking for anything to discredit you. He'll make this personal in ways that will be devastating. I know. Do you? Because I've watched this man operate for 20 years. He doesn't just win, he destroys. Anyone who challenges him ends up discredited, bankrupt, or driven out of town. You think you're prepared for that because he's your father and you know how he operates. But you've never been on the receiving end of his full attention when you're an enemy instead of family. I thought about Sunday dinners, about my father's casual dismissals and public humiliations, about the way he'd stolen my work and called me a disappointment in the same breath. He made me an enemy the night he called me a disappointment while accepting awards for my work. He just didn't realize it yet. Marcus studied me for a long moment, then nodded. All right. Then let's do this properly. I'll start reaching out to the other architects, feeling out who might be willing to participate. David, your lawyer friend needs to see everything, all the documentation from both of us plus Rebecca's new evidence. We'll need her advice on how to structure this, whether we lead with ethics complaints or civil litigation or public exposure. What about going to the city? I asked. They're the ones who approved all these projects. They're the ones whose planning department either missed the pattern or ignored it. Don't they have a responsibility here? The city has a responsibility to protect itself, Marcus said flatly. Going to them first just gives them time to circle the wagons, to claim ignorance, to distance themselves from Mitchell development before the scandal breaks. No, we build the case privately, make it airtight, and then we go public in a way that's too comprehensive and well documented for anyone to bury. Only after there's public pressure and media attention do we approach official channels. We spent another hour going through logistics. Who would contact which architects? How we'd securely share documentation. What timeline made sense for building the case before my father's memoir forced our hand. By the time we left the park, I had a list of tasks and a sense that I'd just committed to something far bigger and more complex than I'd fully understood. On the drive home, David was quiet. I could feel him thinking, processing, worrying. Finally, he said, "Are you going to tell your mother?" The question hit me hard because I hadn't let myself think about it. My mother, who'd spent 40 years standing beside my father, who'd raised us in his shadow, who'd learned to smooth over his rough edges and make excuses for his behavior. My mother, who'd never pursued her own dreams because his took priority. I don't know. Part of me thinks she deserves to know what's coming. But part of me thinks she'll try to talk me out of it, or worse, she'll warn him. She's going to find out eventually. When this goes public, when the accusations start flying and the lawyers get involved, she'll be right in the middle of it whether you prepare her or not. I know. I just don't know how to have that conversation. How do I tell my mother that I'm about to destroy my father's reputation and possibly end their marriage? How do I explain that I'm choosing truth over family peace? Maybe you start by asking her what she knows. Your father's been doing this for 20 years. Your mother's not stupid. She's seen the projects, heard the stories, watched him win awards. Has she ever questioned where the ideas came from? Has she ever wondered why his designs suddenly got so much better around the time he started the systematic theft? I thought about my mother at that Sunday dinner. Her jaw tightening when my father called me a disappointment. I thought about her comment years ago about one person's dreams taking priority in a marriage. I thought about the way she always changed the subject when my father started talking about his achievements, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes during his award acceptance speeches. She knows, I said slowly. Maybe not the details, maybe not the full scope, but she knows something isn't right. She's just chosen not to look too closely. Then maybe it's time she did. That evening I called my mother. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm and unsuspecting. We made small talk about the weather and her garden and whether I'd seen the article in the Savannah Morning News about the new development project downtown. Normal conversation, the kind we'd had 1,000 times. Then I said, "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important. Can I come by tomorrow when Dad's at work?" There was a pause, the kind of pause that happens when someone knows they're about to hear something that will change things. Is everything all right? Are you and David okay? We're fine. But I need to talk to you about Dad. About his projects and his career. It's important. Another pause, longer this time. Rebecca, whatever you're thinking about doing, please think carefully. Your father has worked very hard to build what he has. I know he has, Mom. That's part of what I need to talk to you about. I arrived at my parents' house the next afternoon while my father was meeting with potential investors downtown. My mother met me at the door wearing gardening gloves and an expression that said she'd been dreading this conversation since my phone call. She led me to the sunroom at the back of the house, a space filled with plants and wicker furniture that had always been her refuge from my father's commanding presence in the rest of the house. She poured us sweet tea without asking if I wanted any, a delaying tactic I recognized from my childhood. When she finally sat down across from me, she folded her hands in her lap and waited with the patient resignation of someone who'd known this moment was coming eventually. I spread the documents across the coffee table between us. The photographs of my father's files, Marcus's documentation, my own Whitmore drawings. I walked her through it methodically, explaining the pattern, showing the evidence, describing how many architects had been affected over how many years. She looked at each piece of paper, her expression barely changing, and I realized David had been right. She already knew. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. She sipped her tea, looked out at her garden, and finally spoke in a voice so soft I had to lean forward to hear her. I found the first evidence about 15 years ago. There was a project, I don't even remember which one now, and Frank was working late at home. He'd left some files on his desk and I saw drawings from 2 different firms for the same building, dated weeks apart but nearly identical. I asked him about it, and he explained that it was normal for ideas to overlap in competitive bidding, that architecture wasn't as original as people thought, that good developers knew how to synthesize the best ideas from multiple sources. She set down her tea with a hand that trembled slightly. I wanted to believe him. It was easier to believe him, because the alternative meant my husband was building our comfortable life on other people's stolen work, and I'd been complicit by enjoying the benefits and never asking hard questions. Mom, why didn't you say anything? To who? To Frank? He'd already explained it away as normal business practice. To the city? I had no proof and no credibility. Just a wife questioning her successful husband. To you and James? You were both still in school, still believed your father was a hero. What was I supposed to do? Destroy your image of him with accusations I couldn't prove? So you just accepted it. Her eyes flashed with something between anger and pain. I survived it. There's a difference. Every award ceremony, every newspaper article, every time someone congratulated Frank on his visionary designs, I knew the truth. I knew those visions came from someone else. And I carried that knowledge like a stone in my chest for 15 years while pretending everything was fine. I felt something shift in my understanding of my mother. I'd always seen her as passive, as someone who'd chosen comfort over courage. But now I saw her as someone who'd been trapped, who'd made calculations about what she could live with and what battles were worth fighting. She'd been protecting herself the only way she knew how in a marriage where her husband held all the power, and she'd given up her own career and independence to support his. I'm going to expose him, I said. I have a lawyer. I have other architects who are willing to come forward. I have evidence that shows this was systematic and intentional. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what he's been doing. My mother closed her eyes. I know. I've known since your phone call yesterday that this was coming. And part of me, the part that's been carrying this secret for 15 years, is relieved. But Rebecca, you need to understand what this will do. Not just to Frank but to all of us. Our home is mortgaged against Mitchell Development's assets. Our retirement accounts, our savings, everything is tied to that company and Frank's reputation. If you destroy him, you destroy our financial security. Your brother works for Mitchell Development. His income, his family's stability, all of it depends on that company surviving. So what are you saying? That I should stay quiet to protect the family finances? I'm saying that truth has a price, and you need to decide if you're willing to pay it. Not just for yourself but for everyone around you who'll get caught in the fallout. What about the architects Dad stole from? What about their price? Claire Thompson left the field entirely. James Winters gave up on preservation work. How many careers has he destroyed? How many talented people disappeared because they couldn't compete with someone who was cheating? My mother's composure finally cracked. Her voice rose with emotion I'd rarely heard from her. You think I don't know that? You think I haven't thought about those people every single day for 15 years? But I also thought about keeping a roof over my children's heads and food on the table and stability in a marriage that was already difficult. I made choices, Rebecca. Maybe not brave choices, maybe not honorable choices, but choices that let me survive. And now you're making a different choice and I understand why, but don't judge me for the calculations I made when I didn't have your options. We sat in painful silence. The afternoon light slanted through the sunroom windows, illuminating dust motes and the gulf between us. Finally, I asked the question that had been haunting me since Marcus first showed me the evidence. Did you know about the Whitmore? Did you know he stole my work specifically? She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I suspected. When the project was announced and Frank started giving interviews about his design vision, I recognized things you talked about at family dinners. The way you'd solve the structural problems, the approach to preserving the tin ceilings, the layout of the apartments. It all sounded like conversations I'd heard you having with David. But I didn't want to believe Frank would do that to his own daughter. I told myself I was wrong, that coincidences happen, that maybe you discussed your ideas with him and forgotten. I didn't want to see the truth. And at Sunday dinner last week, when he called me a disappointment while describing my own work, I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and tell everyone in that room what Frank had done. How he'd stolen from you just like he'd stolen from so many others. But I didn't because I've spent so many years staying quiet that I don't know how to do anything else. I gathered up the documents slowly, putting them back in order. I'm going forward with this. Jessica Chun, the lawyer, thinks we have a strong case for professional ethics violations and possibly civil fraud. Marcus is reaching out to other affected architects. We're building a comprehensive case that documents the pattern across 20 years. And when it's ready, we're going public. When? A few months, probably. We need time to gather all the evidence, get statements from witnesses, make sure everything is documented thoroughly enough that it can't be dismissed or buried. My mother stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden she'd spent decades cultivating. Your father's memoir is scheduled for publication in 6 months. He's been working with a publisher, giving interviews, compiling his supposed achievements into a book. If you're going to do this, you'll need to do it before that book comes out. Otherwise, his version becomes the official history. You've been helping him with the memoir. I've been typing his dictated notes and organizing his project files. He wanted my help pulling together the documentation. So yes, I've been complicit in that too. I've been helping him immortalize lies in print, adding one more weight to the stone I've been carrying. She turned back to face me, and I saw exhaustion in every line of her face. If you expose him, I'll support you. Not publicly, not in ways that would make me a target for his anger, but privately. I'll give you any documentation you need that I have access to. I'll testify if it comes to that, though I hope it doesn't. And when this all falls apart, when the marriage ends and the finances collapse and everyone chooses sides, I'll choose yours. Because you're doing what I should have done 15 years ago, and I'm tired of being the woman who chose comfort over courage. I stood and hugged my mother, something we'd never done easily in our family of emotional distance and careful boundaries. She held on to me tightly, and I felt her crying silently against my shoulder. When we finally pulled apart, she wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself back into the polished version of Linda Mitchell she'd perfected over decades. Does David know you're doing this? She asked. He's helping me. He's the one who connected me with the lawyer. He's been documenting evidence and making sure we're building the case properly. I couldn't do this without him. Hold on to that man. Hold on to him tight. Because when this storm hits, and it will hit harder than you can imagine, you're going to need someone who stands beside you when everyone else is running for cover. I left my parents' house with more documentation than I'd arrived with. My mother had quietly made copies of my father's memoir draft, his project files going back 20 years, and correspondence with the publisher that showed he was planning to dedicate an entire chapter to the Whitmore building and his supposed innovative approach to historic preservation. Reading those pages in my car before driving away, I felt rage and vindication in equal measure. He was planning to memorialize stealing my work, to teach future generations his fraudulent approach to success, to permanently erase me from the story of my own achievement. Over the next 6 weeks, the case against Frank Mitchell took shape. Jessica Chun flew down from Atlanta twice to review documentation and interview potential witnesses. Marcus successfully convinced 4 architects to come forward with their stories and evidence. Claire Thompson from the Mercer House Project, James Winters from the Cotton Exchange, and 2 others I'd never heard of whose work had been stolen for projects in the early days of Mitchell Development's rise. Each story followed the same painful pattern. Young architect with talent and vision, competitive proposal process, suspiciously similar Mitchell Development design appearing shortly after, original architect pushed out or bought out or intimidated into silence. Some had kept their documentation hoping one day to get justice. Others had destroyed it trying to move on from the betrayal. But all of them still carried the wound of having their best work stolen by someone with more power and fewer scruples. David and I spent countless nights at our dining room table, organizing evidence and preparing timelines and making sure every claim could be supported with documentation. Jessica insisted on thoroughness above all else. Frank Mitchell would have expensive lawyers and political connections, she reminded us constantly. Every piece of evidence needed to be unassailable. Every timeline needed to be accurate. Every witness needed to be credible. We were building a case that would withstand the best legal defense money could buy. Meanwhile, life continued its strange normalcy. I went to work at Heritage Preservation Associates, took client meetings, reviewed restoration proposals, and pretended I wasn't spending every spare moment preparing to destroy my father's career. David went to his hospital project, solved structural engineering problems, and came home to spend his evenings helping me wage war on my own family. We attended a friend's birthday party and smiled through conversations about upcoming holidays, and whose turn it was to host Thanksgiving, all while knowing that by Thanksgiving, our family would likely be shattered beyond repair. The hardest part was Sunday dinners. My father expected us every week, and declining too often would raise suspicion. So we went, and I sat at that mahogany table under that crystal chandelier and listened to Frank Mitchell hold court about his projects and his vision and his upcoming memoir. He'd started bringing draft chapters to read aloud, subjecting us to his version of events where he was the visionary hero, and everyone else was either an obstacle to overcome or a supporting player in his triumph. The Sunday he read the Whitmore chapter, I had to excuse myself halfway through and lock myself in the bathroom to avoid screaming. He described every challenge I'd solved, every innovation I'd created, every decision I'd made, all framed as his brilliant problem-solving and architectural instinct. He even included a passage about how families supported each other in pursuit of excellence, mentioning that his daughter had helped with some preliminary research, a footnote acknowledgement that erased my 18 months of intensive design work. David found me in the bathroom 10 minutes later, gripping the sink and breathing hard. "We can leave," he whispered. "We can tell them you're not feeling well and go home right now." "No. If we leave, he'll know something's wrong. We're too close to finishing the case to risk him getting suspicious and hiding evidence." "Becca, you're shaking. This is destroying you." "What's destroying me is listening to him steal credit for my work, while planning to publish it in a book that will outlast both of us. But in 8 weeks, maybe less, we'll have everything ready. And then I won't have to sit through another one of these dinners pretending everything is fine." We returned to the table and I endured the rest of the reading with a smile frozen on my face. My mother watched me from across the table with an expression that mixed sympathy and resignation. She knew what was coming. She'd made her choice to support me. And now she was watching the final days of her marriage play out in real time, while pretending to be the devoted wife helping her husband prepare his memoir. In mid-November, Jessica called to say we were ready. We had documented evidence of systematic intellectual property theft across 19 projects spanning 20 years. We had testimony from 5 architects whose work had been stolen. We had my father's own strategy document describing his approach. We had my mother's testimony about what she'd known and when. We had comparison analysis from an independent architectural expert showing the similarities between original proposals and final Mitchell development designs. And we had my personal case with the Whitmore, complete with my original drawings, timestamps, and documentation proving I designed the project my father had claimed as his masterpiece. The plan was to file formal ethics complaints with the Georgia State Board of Architects and the American Institute of Architects, simultaneously releasing a comprehensive report to the media detailing the pattern of theft. Jessica had prepared a press release and supporting materials. Marcus had contacted reporters at the Savannah Morning News, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and several architecture trade publications. We'd coordinated everything to happen simultaneously on a Monday morning, ensuring maximum coverage before my father's team could mount a defense. The Georgia Historical Society Gala was scheduled for the following Saturday. It was the city's premier event for architecture and preservation, black tie and high profile, attended by every major developer, architect, and city official in the region. My father was receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award for his contributions to historic preservation and urban development. He'd been preparing his acceptance speech for months, planning to use it as promotion for his upcoming memoir. I was supposed to attend as his daughter, to smile from the audience while he accepted accolades for work that included my stolen designs. That gala had been circled on my calendar for months as a milestone to endure. But now, sitting in Jessica's Atlanta office reviewing the final case documents, I had a different idea. "What if we wait until after the gala?" I asked. Jessica looked up from her laptop. "Wait? We've scheduled everything for Monday. Media contacts are expecting the story. Filing deadlines are set. Why would we delay?" "Because Monday morning people read about scandal and accusations. But Saturday night at the gala, in front of everyone who matters in Savannah's development and preservation community, they could see the evidence themselves. They could watch Frank Mitchell accept a Lifetime Achievement Award, while simultaneously learning that Lifetime was built on stolen work." "That's a huge risk," David said. "If anything leaks beforehand, if he gets wind of what's coming, he'll have time to prepare a defense. The whole point of the coordinated release is to prevent that." "I know. But think about the impact. The gala is being live-streamed for members who can't attend. There will be photographers, videographers, social media coverage. If we present the evidence there, in that moment it becomes impossible to ignore or bury. The story isn't just about accusations in a press release. It becomes about Frank Mitchell's public unmasking at the exact moment of his supposed triumph." Marcus had joined us by video call, and now his face filled one of the screens on Jessica's desk. "It would be devastating. The optics would be powerful. But Rebecca, you understand what you'd be doing? You'd be standing up in front of your father, in front of your entire community, and calling him a fraud. There would be no anonymity, no hiding behind lawyers and press releases. You'd be putting yourself directly in the line of fire." "I know. And maybe that's what needs to happen. Because this isn't just about legal complaints and ethics violations. It's about looking the man who stole from me, and from so many others in the eye and saying we're not staying silent anymore. It's about making him face what he's done in front of everyone he's spent decades trying to impress. Jessica was quiet for a long moment, her lawyer's mind clearly working through the implications. We'd need to adjust the timeline. Keep everything ready to file Monday regardless, but prepare a presentation for Saturday that's visual and clear enough to explain the case to a room full of people in a way they can't dismiss. We'd need to coordinate with the gala organizers, or find a way to present the evidence without their cooperation. What if I'm the one who presents his Lifetime Achievement Award? I said slowly. I could ask the organizers if I could introduce my father, say a few words about his career before he accepts the award. They'd see it as touching, a daughter honoring her father. But instead of a glowing introduction, I present the evidence. That's brilliant, Marcus said from the screen. And brutal. But brilliant. David shook his head. That's also incredibly personal. Becca, are you sure? Because once you do that, once you publicly unmask him in front of everyone, there's no relationship left to salvage. Even if he somehow wanted to reconcile eventually, after something like that, the bridge would be permanently burned. The bridge was burned the night he called me a disappointment while accepting credit for my work. I just didn't realize I was ready to walk away from the ashes yet. I looked around the room at the people who'd helped me build this case, who'd believed the evidence and supported the pursuit of truth, even when it meant taking on a powerful man with everything to lose. Let's do it. Let's plan for Saturday. And let's make sure that when Frank Mitchell stands up to accept his Lifetime Achievement Award, everyone in that room knows exactly what that lifetime achieved. The week before the gala, I barely slept. Jessica and I worked on the presentation, creating a visual timeline of the stolen projects with side-by-side comparisons of original proposals and final Mitchell development designs. We prepared statements from the affected architects, short video testimonies that could be played on the gala's screens. We assembled the evidence in a sequence that would be clear and undeniable even to people with no background in architecture, showing the pattern in a way that made coincidence impossible to claim. I called the Georgia Historical Society and asked if I could present my father's Lifetime Achievement Award. The director was delighted, thought it was a wonderful idea for a daughter to honor her father at his moment of triumph. He agreed immediately and added me to the program. My father would have no idea I was planning to speak until I walked onto that stage. On Wednesday, my mother called. Frank told me you're presenting his award on Saturday. He's very pleased. He thinks you've finally come around to appreciating his accomplishments. Mom, you know what's going to happen on Saturday night, right? You understand that I'm not there to honor him? There was a long pause. I know, and I'll be in the audience watching. I've already packed a bag and arranged to stay with my sister afterward. I won't be going home with your father that night or any night after. 40 years is long enough to live with a man's lies. I'm sorry. I know this is destroying your life too. No, sweetheart. Your father destroyed my life when he turned our marriage into a performance and our family into props for his reputation. You're just finally showing everyone what's been true all along. I'm proud of you. Terrified for you, but proud. Saturday evening arrived cold and clear. The Telfair Museum glowed with light, its historic columns wrapped in elegant decorations for the gala. I arrived with David, both of us in formal attire, me in a dark blue gown that felt like armor. We checked in, received our table assignment, and made our way through the crowded reception where Savannah's elite mingled with drinks and small talk. My father held court near the bar, surrounded by admirers and colleagues. He wore a custom tuxedo and his most politician-ready smile, working the room like he'd already won the award and was accepting early congratulations. When he saw me, he waved me over. Rebecca. David. Glad you made it. Big night for the Mitchell family, eh? Wouldn't miss it, Dad. The words tasted like metal in my mouth. I'm looking forward to your introduction. Keep it brief though, will you? I want most of the time for my acceptance speech. I've got some important announcements about the memoir and future projects. Don't worry. I'll make sure everyone remembers tonight. He clapped me on the shoulder, completely missing the double meaning in my words, and returned to his admirers. David and I moved to our assigned table near the front. My mother sat 3 tables away with my father's colleagues, catching my eye once with an expression that mixed fear and resolve. The dinner portion of the evening passed in a blur. I couldn't taste the food, barely heard the conversations around me. David kept his hand on my knee under the table, that familiar pressure that meant breathe, I'm here, you can do this. At the table behind us, I noticed Richard Caldwell and several other Mitchell Development executives, all dressed for a celebration that was about to become a catastrophe. Finally, the Georgia Historical Society director took the stage to begin the awards portion of the evening. He worked through several categories, smaller recognitions and scholarships, while I felt my heart rate climbing. The Lifetime Achievement Award was last, the pinnacle of the evening, the moment everyone had been waiting for. And now, the director said, his voice warm with genuine admiration, we come to our highest honor, the Lifetime Achievement Award for contributions to historic preservation and urban development. This year's recipient has transformed the face of Savannah, bringing innovative approaches to adaptive reuse and proving that preservation and progress can work hand in hand. Please welcome Frank Mitchell's daughter, Rebecca Mitchell, who will present tonight's award. Applause filled the ballroom as I stood and walked to the stage. I passed my father's table and saw his proud smile, saw him lean back in his chair like a king about to receive tribute. My hands were steady as I climbed the steps to the podium. David had the laptop ready backstage, connected to the ballroom's projection system. Jessica sat in the back of the room with legal documents ready to distribute to media contacts. Marcus was there too, in the shadows, finally able to watch the truth he tried to expose a decade ago come to light. I stood at the podium and looked out at the audience, at the most powerful and influential people in Savannah's development community, at my father's proud face in the front row, at my mother's terrified eyes 3 tables over. The room fell silent, waiting for my words of admiration and introduction. Good evening. I began, my voice surprisingly calm. I'm Rebecca Mitchell, and I'm here tonight to talk about my father's lifetime of work. But before I do that, I need to show you something important. David, if you could start the presentation. The lights dimmed and the screen behind me came to life with the title slide. A pattern of theft, 2 decades of stolen architecture. I watched my father's smile falter, watched confusion ripple through the audience, and then I began to speak. The ballroom fell into absolute silence as the first comparison appeared on the screen. Claire Thompson's original Mercer House carriage building proposal from March 2009 beside my father's nearly identical design from April of the same year. I walked the audience through the similarities, pointing out specific design elements, structural solutions, and architectural details that had been copied almost exactly. My father stood up from his table, his face going from confusion to fury. This is absurd. Rebecca, what do you think you're doing? I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the audience, on the faces watching the evidence unfold before them. I'm showing everyone what your lifetime achievement was actually built on, Dad. The work of architects whose designs you stole and passed off as your own for 20 years. The next slide showed James Winters and the Cotton Exchange renovation. Then the old fire station conversion. Project after project, each with dated documentation showing the original architect's proposal, followed weeks later by a suspiciously similar Mitchell Development design. The pattern became undeniable, the repetition damning. People in the audience began whispering to each other, pulling out their phones to photograph the screen, the atmosphere shifting from celebration to scandal. These are lies, my father shouted, moving toward the stage. Competitive proposals often have similarities. Any architect will tell you that solving the same problems leads to similar solutions. This is a coordinated attack on my reputation by disgruntled competitors who couldn't match my success. Then explain this, I said, and the next slide appeared. It was his own strategy document, the one I'd found on his computer, describing Mitchell Development's approach to leveraging competitive proposals and developing legally distinct variations. I read selected passages aloud, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. This isn't coincidence or parallel thinking. This is documented corporate policy. You built a business model around stealing other people's work. The whispers in the audience grew louder. I saw city council members exchanging alarmed looks, saw reporters typing frantically on their phones, saw my father's colleagues at his table shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Richard Caldwell had gone pale, probably recognizing his own name in the email chains I was about to display. Stop this immediately, my father demanded, his voice taking on the commanding tone that had always made me feel small. Rebecca, I'm warning you. Stop this now before you say something you'll regret. I finally looked directly at him, meeting his eyes for the first time since I'd started speaking. I've spent my entire life regretting the things I didn't say, Dad. Not anymore. The next series of slides showed the Whitmore building. My original concept drawings from 3 years ago, dated and signed, beside the published images of the completed project. Every major design element matching, every innovative solution identical because they had all come from my mind, my work, my 18 months of intensive design development. This is the Whitmore building that Frank Mitchell is most famous for. The project that won him the Georgia Historical Society's Award for Excellence in Historic Preservation 2 years ago. He's written an entire chapter about it in his upcoming memoir, describing his vision and his innovative approach. I paused, letting the images speak for themselves. I designed this building. Every structural solution, every preservation technique, every detail you see here came from my work. And my father submitted my design as his own, accepted awards for my achievements, and built his reputation on my stolen work. The audience erupted. People stood, some moving closer to see the screen better, others pulling out phones to call colleagues or post to social media. My father stood frozen at his table, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Rage, denial, calculation, panic, all of it visible in the harsh stage lights. Patricia Monroe, the city council member who'd been complicit in the system that enabled this theft, stood up and tried to restore order. These are serious accusations that require investigation and verification. This is hardly the appropriate venue for such claims. You're right, I said. Which is why formal ethics complaints with comprehensive documentation are being filed Monday morning with the Georgia State Board of Architects and the American Institute of Architects. Copies of all evidence have been provided to the Savannah Morning News, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and several national architecture publications. This presentation tonight is just so everyone in this room understands what Frank Mitchell's lifetime achievement actually represents. I advanced to the final slide, a list of names. These are the architects whose work was stolen: Claire Thompson, James Winters, Michael Rodriguez, Lisa Patterson, Kevin Jong. Some left the field entirely. Some rebuilt careers elsewhere. All of them had their best work taken by a man with more power and fewer scruples, and they were silenced by a system that protected reputation over truth. Tonight, on behalf of all of them and on behalf of myself, I'm saying we won't be silent anymore. The room exploded into chaos. Reporters rushed toward the stage with questions. City officials clustered together in urgent conversations. My father's table emptied as his colleagues distanced themselves physically from the unfolding scandal. Richard Caldwell was already on his phone, presumably calling lawyers. My father himself finally moved, not toward me but toward the exit, his shoulders hunched in a way I'd never seen before. The commanding presence that had dominated every room he entered seemed to collapse in on itself. My mother rose from her table and for a moment I thought she would follow him, decades of habit pulling her toward her husband. But instead, she walked to where I stood at the edge of the stage. "You did it," she said quietly, taking my hand. "You actually did it. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for what this means for you." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face but a strange peace in her expression. "Don't apologize. For the first time in 40 years I don't have to pretend anymore. That's worth whatever comes next." David appeared beside us, creating a protective barrier as reporters pressed closer with cameras and microphones. Jessica Chun materialized from the back of the room, all business, directing media questions to the official press release and refusing to let anyone corner me for impromptu interviews. Marcus Webb stood near the bar, watching the chaos unfold with an expression of profound relief. When our eyes met across the room, he nodded once, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. The truth he tried to expose 10 years ago at the cost of his career was finally being heard, finally being taken seriously, and the vindication was written clearly on his face. The Georgia Historical Society director managed to restore some semblance of order, announcing that the remainder of the evening was canceled and asking people to please exit in an orderly fashion. But orderly was impossible. The scandal was too fresh, too shocking, too perfectly timed to be ignored. People clustered in groups throughout the ballroom, rehashing what they just witnessed, pulling up the evidence on their phones, calling colleagues who hadn't attended to spread the news. I saw my father one more time that evening, standing alone in the museum's marble hallway while the crowd filed past. He looked smaller somehow, diminished by exposure in a way his tall frame and expensive tuxedo couldn't compensate for. Our eyes met briefly across the distance, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or denial, but recognition. He finally understood that I'd meant every word I'd said, that I wasn't the compliant daughter he'd always dismissed, and that the life he'd built on stolen work was over. He turned and walked out into the November night without his Lifetime Achievement Award, without his admirers, without the career he'd spent 40 years constructing. I watched him go and felt no triumph, only a hollow exhaustion that came from finally speaking a truth that had been suffocating me for years. The following week was a blur of legal proceedings, media interviews, and institutional responses. The Georgia State Board of Architects launched a formal investigation into Frank Mitchell's professional conduct. The American Institute of Architects suspended his membership pending the outcome of ethics complaints. Mitchell Development's board called an emergency meeting and asked my father to step down as CEO. The publisher canceled his memoir contract, citing material misrepresentations in the manuscript. One by one, the architects whose work had been stolen came forward publicly. Claire Thompson gave an interview to the Savannah Morning News describing how she'd been forced out of preservation architecture after my father stole her Mercer House design. James Winters wrote an editorial for an architecture trade journal about the systemic problems in the development industry that allowed powerful players to exploit competitive bidding processes. Each new story reinforced the pattern, made the case more undeniable, and added weight to the evidence I presented at the gala. The city launched its own investigation into how planning department approvals had been handled during my father's projects. Marcus Webb's name resurfaced in local news as the whistleblower who tried to expose the corruption a decade earlier, and suddenly his forced resignation looked less like early retirement and more like institutional cover-up. The entire system that had protected and enabled Frank Mitchell's theft began to unravel under public scrutiny. My father hired expensive lawyers who issued statements about misunderstandings and competitive industry practices, and the rush to judgment against a respected businessman. But the evidence was too comprehensive, too well documented, and too publicly visible to dismiss. The strategy document in his own words, the email chains with Richard Caldwell, the side-by-side comparisons of stolen designs, my original Whitmore drawings with their damning timestamps, all of it painted a picture that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. 3 weeks after the gala, the Georgia State Board of Architects announced their preliminary findings. Frank Mitchell's architectural license was suspended pending a full hearing. Several of his major projects were being reviewed for potential design credit reassignments. The board acknowledged that their oversight processes had failed to catch a pattern of intellectual property theft that had been occurring for 2 decades, and they promised comprehensive reforms. My mother filed for divorce the same day. She'd moved in with her sister and started seeing a therapist to process 40 years of complicity and silence. When we met for coffee in early December, she looked lighter somehow, like she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "Your father's moved into a hotel downtown," she told me. His lawyer advised against staying at the house during the divorce proceedings. "I think he's hoping I'll change my mind if he makes himself scarce, but that's not going to happen. How are you doing with all this?" Honestly, some days I feel free. Other days I feel like I wasted my entire adult life supporting a man who built his success on lies. But my therapist says I'm allowed to feel both things. That complexity is normal when you're leaving a 4-decade marriage. She stirred her coffee absently. "Your brother called me yesterday." James had been notably absent from my life since the gala. He worked for Mitchell Development in project management, and the company's collapse had cost him his job. I tried reaching out several times, but he hadn't responded to my calls or messages. "What did he say?" "That he understood why you did what you did, but he's not ready to talk to you yet. Losing his job, watching Dad's reputation destroyed, dealing with the gossip about our family, it's been hard on him. He needs time to process." I never wanted to hurt James, or you, but I couldn't stay quiet knowing what Dad had done. My mother reached across the table and took my hand. "I know, sweetheart. And eventually James will understand that too. But right now, he's lost his job and his image of his father and his sense of how the world works. That's a lot to lose at once. My phone buzzed with a message from Jessica Chen. The formal hearing for Frank Mitchell's architectural license revocation was scheduled for January 15th. She needed me in Atlanta the week before to prepare testimony. I added it to my calendar. Another milestone in the long process of holding my father accountable. Christmas came and went quietly. David and I spent it alone, declining invitations from friends who didn't know how to navigate the scandal that had consumed my family. We cooked dinner together, exchanged modest gifts, and tried to pretend that everything wasn't fundamentally different than it had been 2 months earlier. On New Year's Eve, Marcus Webb called. "I thought you'd want to know. The city's reached out to Claire Thompson about restoring credit for the Mercer House project. They're planning to update the historical records and add a commemorative plaque acknowledging her as the original architect. It's a small thing, but it's something." "That's wonderful. Does she know?" "I called her this afternoon. She cried. Said she'd given up hoping anyone would ever acknowledge what really happened." "What about the others? The other architects whose work was stolen?" "We're working through them one by one. Some of the projects are complicated because Mitchell Development made significant modifications during construction, so determining original design credit isn't straightforward. But the city's committed to reviewing everything and correcting the record where possible. It won't undo the damage to their careers, but at least history will be more honest." After I hung up, I sat in our living room watching fireworks over the historic district through our window. David came and sat beside me, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "Any regrets?" he asked. I thought about the question carefully. I thought about Sunday dinners I'd never attend again, about the father who wouldn't speak to me, about my brother's silence and my mother's divorce and the family that had been shattered by truth. I thought about the architects who were finally getting credit for their work, about the systemic problems being addressed, about no longer having to carry the weight of knowing the truth while watching lies celebrated. "No," I finally said. "No regrets. Just grief for what we never really had and relief that I don't have to pretend anymore." In February, the Georgia State Board of Architects formally revoked Frank Mitchell's architectural license. The hearing had been thorough and public, with testimony from multiple architects whose work had been stolen, expert analysis of the design comparisons, and presentation of the internal Mitchell development documents that proved systematic intellectual property theft. The board's decision was unanimous and scathing in its language about professional ethics and abuse of power. Mitchell Development filed for bankruptcy protection in March, unable to survive the scandal and the loss of major contracts after my father's exposure. Richard Caldwell was named in several civil lawsuits from affected architects and ended up settling out of court for undisclosed amounts. The company that had dominated Savannah development for 2 decades dissolved quietly, its assets sold off to pay creditors and legal judgments. My father moved to Charleston after the bankruptcy, taking a consulting position with a small development firm that either didn't know or didn't care about his history. My mother's divorce was finalized in April, and she returned to teaching, something she'd given up when she married. She seemed genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen, throwing herself into her classroom and her students with an energy that suggested she was reclaiming a part of herself she'd lost decades ago. James finally called me in May, 6 months after the gala. We met for lunch at a restaurant far enough from downtown that we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. The conversation was awkward at first, both of us dancing around the enormous thing that sat between us. Finally, he said, "I've been angry with you for a long time. Angry that you destroyed Dad's career. Angry that you cost me my job. Angry that you made our family the subject of gossip and scandal. I understand that. I'm sorry you were hurt by what I did." Let me finish. I was angry, but I was also wrong. I spent the last 6 months going through my own work at Mitchell Development, looking at projects I managed, and I kept finding the same patterns you exposed. Proposals from outside architects that Dad and Richard would study and then produce similar designs for. I saw it happening, and I told myself it was normal competitive practice because that's what I needed to believe to keep working there. But it wasn't normal. It was theft, and I was part of the machinery that enabled it. He looked older than his 35 years, worn down by unemployment and revelation and the weight of complicity. "I got a new job last month," working for a preservation firm in Atlanta. Clean slate, honest work, no connection to Dad or his reputation. And I realized that you gave me that opportunity by forcing the truth out. If you'd stayed quiet, I'd still be at Mitchell Development building my career on Dad's stolen work. So I'm calling to say thank you, even though it took me half a year to get here. We talked for 2 hours, rebuilding something between us that wasn't the same as what we'd had before but was maybe more honest. He told me about his new job, about his wife's relief at leaving Savannah's gossip behind, about his kids who were too young to understand why Grandpa Frank wasn't around anymore. I told him about the cases still working through the legal system, about architects who were finally getting recognition, about the institutional reforms being implemented to prevent future theft. When we parted in the parking lot, he hugged me tight and whispered, "You were braver than I could have been. I hope someday I can be that brave too." In June, almost a year after that Sunday dinner when my father called me a disappointment, the city unveiled a new plaque at the Whitmore building. It read, "Designed by Rebecca Mitchell, Preservation Architect." This adaptive reuse project represents excellence in historic preservation and architectural innovation. They'd invited me to the ceremony, along with Marcus Webb and several of the other architects whose work had been stolen and was now being properly credited. The mayor gave a speech about transparency and integrity in development. The Georgia Historical Society director, who'd been mortified by the scandal at their gala, spoke about the importance of accurate historical records. When they asked if I wanted to say anything, I kept it brief. This building almost died 20 years ago. I spent 18 months of my life figuring out how to save it, how to honor its history while making it useful for the future. Seeing my name finally attached to that work doesn't erase the years when it wasn't, but it means something. It means the truth eventually matters more than power. It means silence doesn't have to be permanent. And it means that the next young architect who creates something brilliant won't have to watch someone else take credit for it, at least not without consequences. David stood beside me in the small crowd, his hand finding mine as we looked up at the building I'd saved and the plaque that finally told the truth about who'd saved it. My mother was there too, standing with Marcus and Claire Thompson and the other architects who'd been vindicated by exposure. My father wasn't invited and wouldn't have come anyway. After the ceremony, I stood alone for a moment in front of the Whitmore building, looking up at the restored facade and the windows that showed the preserved tin ceilings inside. Every detail exactly as I'd envisioned it 3 years ago when everyone said it was too expensive, too difficult, impossible. I'd proven them wrong by doing the work, by solving the problems, by caring enough to save something worth saving. The building would stand for another century at least, maybe longer. Long after everyone involved in the scandal was gone, long after my father's name was forgotten or reduced to a cautionary tale, this building would still be here. And now, finally, it would stand as evidence not of Frank Mitchell's vision but of mine. I thought about legacy, about what we leave behind, about how stories get told and retold until they become history. My father had tried to build his legacy on stolen work, on other people's achievements claimed as his own. He'd wanted to be remembered as a visionary, celebrated in books and plaques and award ceremonies. Instead, he'd be remembered as the man who stole from his own daughter, who built an empire on fraud, who was finally exposed and held accountable. That was his legacy now, unchangeable and permanent. But I didn't need to define myself in opposition to him anymore. I wasn't just the daughter who exposed Frank Mitchell. I was Rebecca Mitchell, preservation architect, the woman who saved the Whitmore building and other historic structures like it. The woman who refused to stay silent when silence served injustice. The woman who chose truth even when it cost everything comfortable and familiar. David joined me in front of the building, slipping his arm around my waist. Ready to go home? I looked one more time at the plaque bearing my name, at the building I'd saved, at the truth finally standing in plain sight. Yes, I'm ready. We walked away through the historic district, past beautiful old buildings that had their own stories of survival and transformation. The afternoon sun caught the windows and made them glow like the past was alive and present, like history wasn't something fixed and finished, but something we kept reshaping by choosing what truths to honor and what lies to expose. My father once told me that legacies were built by people loud enough to be heard. But I'd learned something different. Real legacies were built by people patient enough to create work that mattered, brave enough to demand credit for that work, and principled enough to expose the truth even when easier to stay quiet. The Whitmore building would stand for generations. And now, finally, it would tell the right story. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.